Since When Am I Faust? Chapter 3, Part 2. While she was running, the princess trailed off to the side and collided with one of the many tables set up along the side of the hall. Her body hit it like a freight train, and she sent a platter and a bowl of lavender flying into the air. The sound of clattering silverware echoed throughout the empty hallway, and I winced at the noise of her hitting the ground. Glancing back and forth, I hoped that we hadn't woken anyone up, and then I ran over to check on Luna. Thankfully, she was okay. The princess seemed to be more surprised than she was hurt, and I smiled in relief, glad that she was okay. I reached out and gave her a hoof. Luna blinked a couple of times as she gathered her thoughts together, and a moment later, she reached out and let me help her up. Standing up to her full height, the princess looked at the mess in the hallway and sighed. The flowers and silverware laid all over the floor, and without a word, she began putting things back in their proper place. I decided to leave her to it and trotted over to the kitchen doors. Lifting my foreleg, I pushed the door, and as it swung open, I saw a flicker of green light illuminate the room. The light was accompanied by a familiar sound of flames dancing through the air, and the atmosphere began to smell of ozone. Now, I had only seen the first season of MLP in its entirety, but I had watched enough clips on my own to know what the green flame could most likely be. With that knowledge, I became reluctant to move. I was frightened of what awaited me if I opened the door. From the back of my mind, I felt Lauren look on, seeming as if she was a bit confused at my actions, but then after a momentary pause, she mentally nodded, and seemed to accept my fears. With a gentle nudge, she helped me push the door the rest of the way open, and I took a deep breath. Stepping into the kitchen, I spotted Lily Breeze on the other side of the room, as she tried to make a hasty retreat. My fears momentarily dissipated, and with a serious tone in my voice, I stomped my hoof, as I called out, commanding her to "Halt!" The maid froze, and I could see her mane raise in fear. Her body began to shake as she slowly turned her head to look in my direction. When Lily Breeze laid her eyes on me, I watched as a look of dread covered her features and a bead of sweat slid down the side of her face. I looked back at the nervous maid, and her ears folded back as my stern expression remained on my face. Then her eyes flinched open a little bit more as she spotted Luna stepping beside me. The blue alicorn had finally finished up cleaning her mess, and she peered over my shoulder in curiosity. The princess looked inside the kitchen as she tried to see why I had stopped in the doorway, but when she did, confusion covered her face as she saw none other than my maid standing there. She shrugged and tried to trot past me, but I raised my wing to block her path.
"Luna, if you don't mind, could you wait out here for a moment? I need to talk with Lily Breeze about something."
My voice was stern and cold, and it unintentionally drew even more fear from the maid. The princess stared at me with a look of bewilderment in her eyes. Then slowly she obeyed and made her way back into the hallway. Walking inside the kitchen, I closed the door behind me and turned my attention to Lily Breeze. Somehow, she sank even more under my gaze.
"I'm not mad at you. I just want to talk,"
I assured her, but my words did little to comfort her shivering form. The maid looked up at me with pleading eyes, and then back over to the kitchen door. At seeing her concern aimed in that direction, my frustration spiked, and I kicked the door, earning a muffled cry of pain from Luna on the other side. Letting out a sigh, I shook my head.
"Let's continue this elsewhere."
Taking in our surroundings, I looked for the closest place for us to talk privately, so we walked into the connected dining hall and closed the doors behind us. When it was just the two of us in there, I walked over and stood in front of Lily. I reached down to her quivering form and raised her chin to look at me. She whimpered in fear, but I assured her.
"Shh, it's alright. I'm not going to hurt you. But Lily, could you please tell me your real name and drop your disguise?"
As soon as I said those words, the maid in front of me shrunk back with terror and crouched down, covering her head.
"It's a darling!"
A flash of green flames washed over her, and they revealed a small changeling queen. She was barely even the size of me. Her hair was a brilliant shade of dark turquoise, and her black carapace glistened in the moonlight. Small fangs peeked out at the front of her snout, and her terror-filled eyes reminded me of a cat. As I looked at her with curiosity and wonder, I began to feel sad for her. She was so scared, her wide, terrified eyes looking up at me almost as if she was waiting to be vaporized on the spot. Doing my best not to frighten her any more than I already have, I gave a kind smile and nodded.
"Adorlin, that's a nice name. So what brings you to Canterlot?"
Her lip quivered, and her ears folded back. Tears began to form at the corner of her eyes, and she gave way to sobbing. Concern washed over me, and I tried to move closer, hoping to comfort the changeling, but she backed up at my approach. I paused at this, and breathed out as I lightened my expression. With a gentle smile, I tried to share the love I had in my heart, but I wasn't exactly sure if I was doing it right. It felt more like I was just staring at her, hoping that she could sense my concern. The changeling was still scared, but when I tried to reach out again, she slowed her retreat just enough for me to put a forearm around her. At first, she froze up, and closed her eyes as tears ran down her cheeks. A moment later, though, she looked up at me with surprise, the shock overpowering her fear for a moment as she looked up at the pony gently stroking her mane.
"Shh, it's alright. It's okay."
I felt some of the tension in her shoulders lighten, but it was only slightly. She was breathing heavily, and her mouth was quivering. To my surprise, she started to speak, but she still struggled to answer as she choked on her words through her sobbing. Her words came out almost as a whisper, and her voice was trembling.
I came to warn about my mother. She wants to attack Kennerlet, and I said that we shouldn't.
Her expression became downcast, and tears slid down her cheeks. She then looked up at me.
For speaking out against the queen, my mother, I was thrown out of the hive.
She began to cry, and my heart started to hurt as I saw the desperate expression in her eyes. She was so young, but it was plain to see that she was already well accustomed to feeling hopelessness. It was painful, and I could feel Lauren begin to hold some anger towards the changeling's mother. How dare she so easily cast her daughter aside? I sighed and extended my wings. I used them to wrap Adorlin in a warm hug, and I pulled her closer as I tried to soothe her pain. She was still shaking, but her breathing was beginning to calm down. I rocked her back and forth as I stroked her mane. She croaked, and her quiet whimper suddenly went unrestrained. She then cried out and grabbed a hold of my forearm. She buried her head into my chest and gave way to sobbing. It was as if after a great period of time she was finally able to tell someone all of her hidden pain, and she was finally able to be acknowledged. Because of that, her tears went unrestrained, and she wept bitterly. I looked up, a faint frown forming on my face as I thought of what her life had been like. From what I could tell, she wasn't any older than myself, yet I could hardly imagine what she's been through. Just having to survive on her own after leaving behind all she's ever known. Even so, she came here, and I cared for her. Wrapping my other arm around her, I sat there, letting her cry herself out. We ended up sitting like that for a few minutes as she cried, and her tears soaked a little patch of fur onto my chest. When she finally started to calm down, the changeling pushed herself out of my embrace, and I looked at her with a soft smile.
Feeling better?
She nodded, wiping her tears. I then leaned forward and put a hoof on her shoulder.
Adorlin, thank you for telling me. I know it wasn't easy for you.
I wiped a tear off of her cheek.
We'll talk more later, but for now, I'd suggest that you head back to your room. Otherwise, Luna's gonna find some way to get involved in this.
Adorlin gave a quick nod and wiped her eye as she put her disguise on once more. I stood up and then helped her up. She looked at me with an appreciative smile and gave a short bow before turning to the door. Lily stopped and turned to face me with a bewildered expression on her face.
Wait, does this mean that I'm still your maid?
I grinned and gave her a lighthearted chuckle.
Yes, Lily. For the sake of keeping your disguise believable, I think that's for the best.
A bright smile made its way onto her face, and her eyes shined.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Then she left, walking out the doors to the dining hall. As I sat there, still processing what Adorlin had said about upcoming events, Lorne quickly took control of our horn and unlocked the kitchen door in the other room. The sound of Luna falling through the doorway reached my ears, and I smiled as I was pulled from my thoughts. I walked over towards the kitchen, and as I walked through the door, I saw Luna staring at me as she waited for an explanation. While she stared, she noticed the damp spot on my coat, and she raised an eyebrow at me.
What is that?
I looked at her with a puzzled expression, and followed her gaze. Breathing out, I shrugged.
She was crying, so I tried to comfort her. She's fine now.
Crossing her forelegs on the kitchen counter, she furrowed her brow as she asked.
So I was locked out, why?
I shrugged.
She was feeling really awkward, and I wanted her to feel more comfortable talking to me, so I figured it was best as a one-on-one situation.
Luna frowned, but she didn't press any further. I let out a small yawn as I turned my attention back over to the kitchen. After all, the reason I came down here in the first place was to get a snack. I swung a set of double doors open and glanced back at the princess. Looking at Luna, I asked,
So, what would you like for breakfast? Or would it be considered dinner, in your case?
Luna rolled her eyes and sighed.
I already got my food.
She said this, gesturing to her plate of mixed greens, and I nodded as I turned back to my search for food. I turned back to the cupboards.
Alright then, it's just me. Apple pie and cinnamon, second fridge to the left top drawer. Oh, thanks.
Luna looked at me with a confused face as I hopped down and made my way over to the fridge. She then took another bite of her salad and then asked,
Wait, how did you know where the food is? Normally it's the attendants who get us our meal. Didn't she just get food? Well, I guess she's been here longer than us. Yeah, good point.
I set the plate of apple pie on the table and kicked the fridge door closed.
Well, when I first arrived here, I was kinda hungry, so I ended up clearing out the cupboards on the left side of the kitchen over there.
I said this as I looked down at the plate, and felt a mild sense of disappointment because only one slice was left. Luna gave me a slight grin as she continued eating her meal. Then suddenly her fork raised and she attacked, aiming for my pie. I barely saw it coming and defended my meal with my arm. She tried again, but as she did, I tossed a slice up and took a quick chomp as I stuffed the pastry into my cheeks. The princess put on a frown, feigning a pout at her defeat, and I stood up on my hind legs, throwing my arms out. I waved them back and forth in victory as I spoke with stuffed cheeks.
The pie is mine, Luna. It's all mine. Haha.
My goofy display was suddenly interrupted by the sound of the kitchen door opening, and with my cheeks ballooned out and pastry crumbs all over my muzzle, I looked over to the door. Standing there was the head chef, and the rest of the kitchen staff were there behind him. They all had a look of shock and discomfort as they looked at me, and a moment of silence passed as I dropped back down to standing on all fours. The awkwardness in the air became suffocating, and Luna looked back and forth between the kitchen staff and me. Sighing, she put her hoof on her temple and hooked her head.
Mother, please swallow your food. You look like an idiot. Oh, Luna, das wood.
I can only imagine what the chefs thought with seeing an alicorn with a pie stuffed in her face. I'm just surprised that none of them burst out laughing. But then again, they're proper ponies. They would never do such a thing, I think. Now let's get on to our prim and proper donators. Top donators: Taco Cat 598, Peter Coulthard, J Tin Man, Darkside, Gauntlet, and Only One Thing. Zar630, Strix, Raiden, Narwhals, Black Moonheart, Drake Lovedragon, Pastel Skies, Austin Roland, Magazine, Crazy Killer 557, Dospo, Madman Stan, Delta Omega, Jack Hedge, RuneTyphon9852, Hudson Norman, Stephen Bingham, McDoofus456, Dash of Evergreen, Ronnie Dragonwolf, Ponyman, Tal Rasha, The Toilet Snake, Sword Brother and Mordred, Ronan Wandering, Random Person Man Guy, Easy, Skyuchia, Leslie Prickett, Jordan Peterson, Crimson Kitten 9, Lightskin, Monster Kitty, Needs a Life, Milan Biehanek, Michael De La Moore, and many more spectacular people. Thank you all so much for watching this video, and live life to the fullest.